Hello and welcome. My name is Andres Carrete. I am a PhD student in the Classics Department here at UCSB, and I'm joined today by Padilla Peralta, who is an assistant professor of classics at Princeton and also the author of Undocumented, a Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a homeless shelter to the Ivy League. He is joining us today as part of the Critical Issues series, centered this time around the changing faces of U.S. citizenship. Lynette, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real delight to be in Santa Barbara.
Well, thank you. You have a very unique perspective when it comes to issues surrounding citizenship and immigration. Not only a very deep personal journey, but also a very historically informed perspective. So I want to center our discussion around those issues, mostly the issues of citizenship and immigration. And I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, do we have a consistent picture of what it means to be a citizen? Do we have elements in our definition that are common throughout kind of the ages?
There's some real inconsistencies in definitions and expectations of citizenship. Some of those inconsistencies have to do with the historical context in which citizenship as an institution and as a practice first emerges and flourishes. In my training as a historian of the Greco-Roman world, I've been particularly drawn to moments where citizenship is calibrated or differentiated. And the conspicuous instances of that have seized my attention, that have fascinated me for quite some time, are the stages in Rome's expansion after 338 BCE, when the Roman Republic develops this tiered citizenship. But there are ample precedents for this. Already in the classical Greek world, in the Athenian context, you see these innovations made, these tweaks made to the parameters of citizenship. And those, too, introduce many different gradients. So there is, on the one hand, this illusion of uniformity, that anyone and everyone who's designated as a citizen is, in a sense, equal as a citizen. But on the other hand, in historical and institutional practice, there are some clear dividing lines, very bright dividing lines. And it's those lines that I find myself most intrigued by.
Do you feel there are certain anxieties that show up in these moments?
Mm-hmm. Undoubtedly. So the anxieties take various forms. So some of the anxieties have to do with xenophobic or nativist sentiment, which is abundantly documented for periods of antiquity in classical Athens, in classical Rome, and in a host of other Mediterranean societies. There are also anxieties that govern what I have taken lately to terming the insularity of citizenship. And that's something that I'll be addressing in a lecture. So when I say insularity, I mean it in two different ways. I mean, first, the fact that so much of the conceptual scaffolding of citizenship takes its root in movements across islands. But I also mean insularity as a trope and as a metaphor for thinking about how, with the scholar Benitez Rojo, citizenship acts as a kind of repeating island. So citizenship is, in a sense, bound up with the logic of deferral. People who are aspiring for citizenship and for civic incorporation in communities often find that full integration or full incorporation is insistently or repeatedly deferred. So just when they think that they've made it, that they've somehow been fully welcomed, another obstruction raises its head. And that obstruction is as much psychic as it is institutional. In fact, the two blur into each other. So in modern 21st century context, I attend in some of my work to the anxieties that are generated among immigrants by the specter of the enforcement and surveillance state by USCIS and ICE in the American context, but also by the whole range of practices that we develop to keep reminding those who have been incorporated into the civic body or who are seeking to be incorporated into the civic body that they don't quite belong. And some of those practices are racialized quite explicitly and tangibly, and so that's what I keep returning to.
Thank you. It's a very powerful answer. What aspects of citizenship do you feel, if any, have changed? Is there anything in our modern kind of discourse that we should be anxious about?
Mm-hmm. So some of the changes are normally framed as implicated in the expansions of the suffrage, right? So if citizenship is to be indexed to voting power, which is not a self-evident connection, but We can set that aside for now. Then one of the really signature transformations in citizenship has been, in modern liberal democratic regimes, the expansion of the possibility and prospects of citizenship to an ever-widening group of communities. The expansions take multiple forms, so the move away from an only male model of citizenship to extending the suffrage to women. The extending of the suffrage to groups that had been historically or structurally oppressed in the United States context, the awarding of the franchise to the formerly enslaved. These are some of the ways in which citizenship has undoubtedly changed. But there's also a broader move afoot. The historian and philosopher Michael Walzer had argued in a series of publications that really what we have in view are two very distinct models of citizenship operative in a Euro-American context. One he saw as being ancient, and the other he saw as being more modern. So in the ancient paradigm, according to Walzer, you had this appeal to a participatory model of citizenship, in which citizens were expected to participate in self-governance. In Aristotle's famous words, the citizen is one who is governed and governs in turn, right? And then you have citizenship as a institution geared around the protection of rights. So citizenship entails certain fundamental protections that are enacted and preserved by the state over a discrete group of individuals within the community. These two models of citizenship, as Walzer and others have pointed out, are not the same. The question then becomes, well, at what point does one intervene and take over from the other? Is there, in fact, a continuous development, or is there a dramatic discontinuity and rupture? And that's a question that I keep circling back to in some of the writing I do on citizenship.
I want to zone in on something that came out of your memoir, but I feel is an important concept when we discuss citizenship, and it's this idea of ownership, which you discuss in your epilogue. Can you talk to us a little bit about what this idea of ownership is and what it means to you, and then maybe a couple of follow-up questions based on that?
Yeah. So in the memoir, at the conclusion, I placed a great deal of emphasis on the need to claim one's place in America. And by the claim part, I meant not so much to downplay or minimize the extent to which immigrants have already claimed America. And one of the things I emphasize in the epilogue is that we as immigrants have made America ours already. But the need for a kind of continuous verbal affirmation of this, and the need to devise critical and pointed counters to those who would allege that America does not belong to immigrants. And so I see this act as significant for several reasons. The first is that one of the tragedies of the civic experience of this differentiated and insular citizenship that I alluded to earlier is that in an inescapable way, immigrants will always be asked to perform and reperform their citizenship. And that is not without psychic costs. I think it's important to be upfront about the stakes of that. But I think that it has the potential, if deployed properly, to become a practice for emancipation. And as I see it, the practice of emancipation that this form of verbal affirmation lends itself to is a form of insistent interrogation of the assumed and take it for granted claims that many who have not traversed the trajectory of the immigrant tend to hold dear about their own identities as American. So for immigrants to claim America as theirs is an invitation to everyone in America to consider what it is about their claim to the United States that empowers them to feel as citizens, to think as citizens, and to reevaluate what it is that they're doing to affirm their citizenship. Right?
Thank you. So on this idea of ownership, do we have any historical trace that we can follow of similar claims or similar instances in which this becomes an issue?
Mm-hmm. So ownership, I think, has taken several forms in the trajectory of the expansions of the franchise and of expansion of access to citizenship. So the most conspicuous instance, well known to many folks, is of course the arc of the civil rights movement. I was in Memphis recently and had the privilege and really the empowerment of walking through the National Civil Rights Museum. And what I found so rewarding about the experience was that the museum, in a manner that I think is very much in line with some of the recent museological work to commemorate the civil rights movement, really underlines the work that is involved in claiming one's citizenship. And that work takes several forms. So the first, and the one that receives such incredible exposition in the museum, is the coordinated collective action that is required. So the claiming of a place in America and the claiming of ownership of the idea of what it means to be American, what it means to be an American citizen, is for me not an individualized proposition. It has to involve an entire community or communities acting in concert to support individual members and to really assert that claim in the face of structural denials to that claim. Then the other dimension of this, one that's not at all dissociable from the civil rights movement, but that I'm hiving off simply for the purposes of analytic clarity, is the need to develop intellectual histories of citizenship that show that already in its inceptions and trajectories, the very notion of citizenship is inseparable from claims of ownership and from a tradition of contesting who claims ownership. So here is where my own training as a Greco-Roman historian has proven at once both advantageous and detrimental. It's advantageous in that it's oriented me to look to the Greco-Roman Mediterranean as a site for the testing of various models of citizenship. It's detrimental because one of the many forms of value to which many of us who are in the field of Greco-Roman studies tend to be socialized is this idea that everything begins with the Greeks and Romans. But for various reasons, not least the fact that this kind of argument has been weaponized by white supremacists across the generations, I tend to find it to be somewhat reprehensible. I also think that there is a much richer story to be told if we think in a truly comparative vein about citizenship. And that means looking at the ancient Near East, where Amélie Kurt and others have isolated clear and distinct progressions towards institutions of citizenship already in the second millennium BC and early first millennium BC. This means looking at China and looking at developments throughout Eurasia, both in the later stages of the first millennium BC and after. And it also means looking at Mesoamerican models of civic belonging and incorporation. So to be a Greco-Roman historian in this space, I think, is to have a certain toolkit made available for investigating these questions. But it's also, if not critically pursued, potentially a way of siloing oneself off from a much broader conversation that has to take place.
So going off of that a little bit, do you see that as your main role as an academic? How do you see academics fitting into this space, into this discussion? What do we bring to the table, and what are our responsibilities when discussing these sort of issues?
I think we have a responsibility to pursue equity and justice in the academy. And that means, I think, first attending to the many, many forms that citizenship and institutions of citizenship take over time and space. For me, there are sort of tiered obligations that follow on the heels of this. So it has been the standard for a long time in the academy to insist that academics pursue their work with rigor. And I value rigor. But I also think that rigor is used as a code word for dismissing forms of thinking that are not easily compartmentalized within various disciplinary silos. So I tend to eye warily claims that are made within certain academic disciplines that, well, we can't pursue this sort of line of work or this line of engagement out of the fear, out of the anxiety that we'll be insufficiently rigorous in doing so. It's like, well, whose rigor are we talking about exactly? But here there's a sort of a general question that ranges well past theories and concepts of citizenship to encompass the whole matrix of social relations that anchor and buttress the academy. The question, as I see it, is how and to what degree and with what efficaciousness academic work serves to promote the emancipation of its subjects. And I have become fairly dismissive of late of claims of pursuing knowledge for knowledge's sake. I like knowledge. I like knowing things. It makes me feel more invigorated to know things. But I am not one of these people who sees academic knowledge as autotelic. And for me, the most redeeming and rewarding aspect of the work we do is the promise of one day being able to, with that work, with that research in hand, intervene in and assist in the construction of a more robustly just society at our institutions and beyond our institutions. And so, to that end, I think it's really important to use fields such as the historical and comparative study of citizenship to theorize afresh how our social relations should be ordered, can be ordered, will be ordered, and how we might design programs of research that most fruitfully accommodate that.
Okay. So this may be a little bit off of our path, but it brings up something that came up in your memoir when you were discussing with one of your friends who was also an Ivy League student, this idea of fake liberalism. Do you feel that that's at play well, would you mind explaining what it is, first of all? And do you feel like that's at play when we see these kind of academic gatekeepers, if you will? And does that hinder kind of what we're trying to do when thinking of a more just society and a more just academic setting that would bring about these sort of changes that we're kind of discussing?
So yeah, in the book, I touch on this, the postures of liberalism that are adopted not infrequently in academic contexts. And for me, the issue was fraught with several complications. So on the one hand, I was in an undergraduate space at the time and would be in graduate school spaces where many people bought into the idea that, well, we were all well-meaning liberals. We were all oriented towards the same kinds of causes and objectives. And I found some of this baffling, not because I was not myself a liberal progressive, but because I thought that we were so differently situated, and that to deny the implications of that differential situatedness was to obscure what for me was one of the central tenets of liberal progressivism, ensuring not just that we had some kind of equalizing valence or force to the social arrangements we pursued, but that we had real and lasting equity, right? So this was a challenge that I found myself wrestling with, both throughout the course of my undergraduate career and then beyond. And one of the issues that it brought to the fore in my view and in the view of some of my peers and colleagues was how to have conversations about this differential situatedness in ways that would maximally empower those who were on the receiving end of structural violence, and that would also push those who were the beneficiaries of various forms of privilege to think more critically about what forms that privilege took like. And here, the academy is a site for the enactment, staging, and duplication of privilege at scale. And what I have tried to impress on my colleagues and my peers is that none of these conversations can ignore the degree to which academic institutions are responsible for the promotion, preservation, and perpetuation of forms of structural inequality. And to pretend otherwise is to not really be about the game.
Right.
And opening one's eyes to this will, in turn, ideally lead to a more finely toned assessment of what it is that one and one's communities can do to ameliorate that when and as possible.
So one of the big trends in your work is kind of affirming one's identity, I feel, and I may be kind of self-projecting here, but I feel that that's very important, especially in a time when we see that many of the people who hold bias against whatever group it may be, immigrants, people of racial minorities, they almost create this imagined caricature that they then kind of project their fear onto. So do you think can you speak a bit to the power of kind of affirming one's identity, I'm thinking here specifically of you kind of coming out as an undocumented immigrant. Um, and I would just like to hear kind of your thoughts on that. Is there power in doing that? I know there's a lot of fear associated with it, a lot of kind of anxiety that is necessitated. But for those in a position to do so, who are maybe not as vulnerable as others, do you feel like that is an empowering movement, an empowering action? Could you speak to that?
So it was the decision to come out was, as I describe in the book, fraught with all kinds of anxieties and fears. But there had been one refrain playing in the back of my mind, even as I made the set of decisions that culminated in coming out as undocumented. And it was the sense, the deep sense that being public about my status was not going to free me.
Right.
It would situate me to contribute to a conversation, and perhaps I thought it might model for others what the stakes of this public stance, and really what the prospects of assuming that public stance might look like. But I didn't see anything emancipatory in the act of coming out itself. I saw it as more conducive to opening up a sphere of social relations that I would find down the road much more enhancing and rewarding. So in the book, I do talk a fair bit about the honesty axis. I mean, what does it mean to harbor a secret, and what does it do to you to harbor that secret? And I did very much want to encourage others to see me in all of my dimensions, and to deny or to occlude or veil this cornerstone aspect of my identity was to prevent them from having that clarity of vision. But I also wanted to insist on, and over the years I've become, I think, even more insistent about the fact that the decision to come out is one that has to be taken on one's own time. That the act of publicly affirming one's identity is one that, for all that it relies on communal support, for all that it is implicated in the forms of collective action I was referencing earlier, is, in the end, an intensely personal decision. One of the many debates, especially in the early stages of the Dreamer movement, and continuing even now with conversations about the documented and the predicament of the documented under this presidential administration, is how incumbent is it on folks who are undocumented to come out and publicly affirm their identities. And I have this very intense, at times a bit anguished exchange some years ago with two colleagues, one of whom has gone on to do a great deal of work in the movement, and who was advising a fellow undocumented a student to make their status known publicly, and that student wasn't ready, and so I said, folks got to do this on their own time. And one of the most pernicious aspects of the many depredations of the immigration enforcement state is that it robs people of time. It robs people of the leisure that they need in order to arrive at the most dynamically efflorescent sense of identity that they can construct for themselves and for their communities. So to the extent that the movement can afford people that time, can create the spaces of luxury that will enable them to make the journey that they need to make, that is a good thing. But to the extent that folks in the movement prioritize the public performance of affirming status over and above the interior dimensions that I think are as crucial as anything else to one's own sense of understanding, then I think it's time to consider resituating and re-emphasizing the interiority that needs to be at the center of the work that we do.
Thank you. As I mentioned to you briefly when we were prepping for the interview, I'm a child of the border. I was born in El Paso, Texas, but my family has historically been from Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, which is not only a beautiful town, which I very much love, but it's also riddled with a lot of violence, unfortunately. So one of the things that I saw in my own experience living in El Paso is that often you see people who standing next to each other, you might assume they were cousins, brothers. Um, but the idea of citizenship creates this divide when it happens often, where you have people who receive a certain status looking down upon those who don't. How do we address these issues when they basically divide people who, by all other measures, are one people? Um, do we have any precedents for that? Do we have anything that can help us maybe reconcile those ideas or help us move beyond them?
Hmm. Something that I've been very taken with in some of the work I've been doing on citizenship is how citizenship acts to enact and police distinctions within groups. So, citizenship and its allocations, its ascriptions, have this twofold objective. On the one hand, the state responsible for conferring citizenship orders groups in certain ways, decrees that some are eligible for citizenship, others are not eligible, or decrees that some have to wait for citizenship. Then the state differentiates within those groups that have already been created or rendered visible by state power, and says, within those groups, some of you get citizenship, others of you don't. And this partitioning and division extends to families, right? So this is where we get the phenomenon of mixed status families and mixed status communities. What's been salient about this dimension of the state's adjudication of citizenship for me is that it interfaces with something that's also been of interest to scholars of immigration history, both in antiquity and especially in the near past and in the American present. And that is the degree to which those who ultimately succeed in attaining citizenship are invited to partake of a species of amnesia. So what is manifestly clear is that the journey to citizenship and to civic incorporation is saddled with trauma. And once people do get citizenship, in the spirit of those and in the style of those who harbor traumas, they do not want to remember what it took. And so this is something that requires a great deal of work to overcome, because I see it as one of the sort of central hurdles in forging a truly sweeping collective action for more efficaciously just immigration laws. But that work to overcome this hurdle has to start from the premise that the reason why folks are participating in this form of amnesia is because the journey to citizenship is so traumatic and because they don't want to remember it. And this is true across the generations. I mean, this is one of the reasons why it can be very difficult to have conversations with folks whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents came several generations ago, because they instinctively lapse into habits of framing their family's movement into civic incorporation that minimize or downplay the real force and structural violence of the trauma that their family suffered. And even when they acknowledge that it was hard for their families, they don't actually dwell on the implications of that, because to dwell on the implications of that would be destabilizing if taken in its most multidimensional aspect. A meditation along these lines would force many people to begin questioning why it is that they have status in the first place, and that's not a conversation many people want to have. And so the mechanisms that emerge to conceal and sideline trauma kick in. So rather than saying, as quite a few folks have said, as I've said on occasion, that really people who are insensitive to the plight of those currently journeying through the deserts of status are simply trying to pull up the ladder behind them. I think we should be saying what this reveals is that the movement to citizenship is deeply, bitterly traumatic, and that many people forget because it is a coping strategy.
Do you see this? I feel this is the case that we see a very similar phenomenon occurring when we have people transcending into basically a higher state of privilege. Do you feel it's a similar mechanism behind that? Because I mean, this, and you'll forgive me for saying this, but it sounds a lot like academia in many senses. It sounds a lot like people who are accepted in certain communities and certainly seem to want to distance themselves from the community that raised them, brought them up. So how do you think we can address that at a personal level? And then is there any way to address that in a more structural kind of sense?
Therapy. That's really the best answer I can come with. And there has to be a collective movement towards therapy at the individual and at the communal level. So some of this therapy can take the form of art. Some of it can take the form of the full roster of social services that will facilitate access to therapy. But whatever form it takes, this has to be a therapeutic experience. Because in the end, as you pointed out, there are many, many institutions in our society that work by motoring along to the same logic. The status and distinction protocols of the academy, of upward mobility, framed as generously as possible, are ultimately in bed with this model, the model that encourages folks to make their way through the system and to think as little as possible about the psychological and psychoaffective stakes of that progression. So therapy, lots of therapy for everyone, all the time.
Hear that. Well, I want to thank you for not only speaking to us today, but for being kind of an example, putting a face on the journey of an immigrant and opening doors as you've gone through these kind of stages. Because I feel that that's empowering for us as a generation coming behind you to see that and to see that we can rise to something more, to use our voices as powerfully as possible. So I want to thank you for that. Is there anything else that you would like to address or anything you would like to speak on? I know you have a lecture later on, but
you've been admirably comprehensive. No, thank you so much for getting me to rethink and reimagine. The questions are everything.
Well, that's been our time today. Thank you very much for this interview again. To Daniel, thank you for joining us, and we'll be seeing you again.